Let your eyes close and imagine you are living in medieval Europe, hundreds of years ago. No electricity, no vehicles, only the distant tolling of a church bell and the smell of cooking smoke seeping through every wooden door crack. The wind carries the dampness of the earth and the aroma of freshly baked bread, but also the hidden scent of dry hay and straw from the nearby cattle sheds. The thatched roofs bow like old men whispering secrets to one another. The narrow, rough cobblestone path leads to the main square, flanked by small shops sealed with wooden bars, open just a crack for the owners to peer at passers-by. But you are not a farmer, not a blacksmith, nor a traveling merchant. You were born into a family whose fate was decided before you ever took your first breath. You are the child of an executioner. In that era, it was a necessary profession to maintain the law, yet it was considered unclean, shunned by all like a shadow. From the moment you were in the cradle, you bore an invisible mark that made others only dare to look from afar. They might offer a polite smile upon meeting your gaze, but they would quickly look away, as if your eyes carried an unbreakable curse. You are not allowed to sit at the same table in the tavern. When you enter the market, a space naturally opens around you, and conversations abruptly fall silent. You are not allowed to join the harvest festival, nor dance around the bonfire like the others. Even the church, considered the embrace of all souls, rejects you and your family. They say that hands accustomed to wielding an axe to carry out sentences should not touch God's altar. Your house stands outside the city walls, on a piece of land slightly higher than the fields. From there, you can see the red-tiled roofs and bell towers of the town, but it feels like looking at another world, one not meant for you. The wooden house is not large, but it is sturdy, built to withstand the strongest winds and the longest winter nights. The roof is thatched with thick straw, the bundles woven tightly as if to ward off all prying eyes. During the day, light filters through a few cracks in the walls, painting faint yellow stripes on the packed earth floor. At night, the entire room is lit by a single candle, its flame flickering as if eavesdropping on every story. You grow up in that space, accustomed to the whistle of the wind through the door cracks, the sound of branches scraping against the straw roof, and the sound of your father's footsteps as he leaves the house at dawn, sometimes for work, sometimes just to sharpen his tools for the next day. You know those footsteps well, heavy and slow, unhurried, but never distracted. They are the steps of a man accustomed to walking into places everyone else wants to avoid. Every morning, before the sun has even touched the threshold, you hear the sound of metal on a whetstone. A steady, rhythmic sound, like a heartbeat. That sound, to you, is both the soundtrack of your childhood and a reminder that your family is different. You know it is your father sharpening his axe or sword, not for hunting or protecting the home, but to prepare for a morning standing in the crowded square, where all eyes will be on him. The days of judgment are days of unusual bustle in the town. From the moment the sky lightens, a low murmur of conversation drifts from the distance. People flock to the square, both curious and anxious. Mothers warn their children not to get too close, but the children still find ways to weave through the crowd, vying for a spot with a clear view. On those days, you often sit by the window, looking down the road, leading into town and see your father's figure walking. Long cloak, hood pulled low, his steps slow but steady. No one greets him, but no one blocks his path. The road opens before him on its own, as if the very air shies away. In the evening, when everyone has returned home and the fires in the hearths begin to crackle, the square will be empty again. Only a few marks remain on the ground and a thick, heavy silence. Your father returns, hangs his cloak on the wooden hook near the door, sits down at the table, and eats his dinner in silence. No one in the family asks about his day, not out of fear, but because they all know that work does not need to be recounted in words. On long winter nights, you lie under the blankets, listening to the wind slip through the door cracks, and wonder, can I escape this preordained path? But in that era, fate is like the cobblestones of a road. Once laid, they are very difficult to move. You were born here, in this house, with a name that people whisper, but never say aloud. And you know that, sooner or later, you too will don that cloak, step outside the city walls on misty mornings, and become the person the world both needs and avoids. And that is the story I will tell you tonight. There are no gruesome scenes here, only the sounds, the breath, and the rhythm of life of a person who stands at the edge of every celebration, yet is the center of every gaze in the fateful moment. A life not chosen, but one that still flows, day after day, until that same hand closes its own door. Take a deep breath, breathe out slowly, and let us begin that journey back into the past. They often say a child is born a blank slate, but in that wooden house outside the city walls, the page was stamped with a red seal before it even had a chance to be white, not with wax, but with the prejudice of the entire village. From the moment you cried your first cry, no one asked, "What will this child become?" Because the answer was already there. He will do as his father did, and as his grandfather did before him. In the Middle Ages, some trades were passed down through generations as a source of pride. Blacksmith, shipwright, baker. But there were also trades passed down like a hereditary disease, and executioner was one of them. No one wanted it, but once you were in this clan, you could not pass it to anyone other than your own blood. Your childhood did not have mornings spent running in the fields to pick wildflowers or climbing the apple tree behind the house to pick fruit. Instead, you learned to walk in silence, to avoid drawing attention, and to understand that the eyes of others would always try to avoid meeting yours. If they did look, it was only to remind themselves, that is the executioner's child. The other children in the village played with wooden hoops, spinning tops, or logs carved into horses. As for you, your toys were the wood scraps from your father's workbench, frayed ropes, or a few old cloth bags used to hold, something you never told anyone about. You don't remember ever receiving a new toy from the market. The only thing resembling a gift you ever received was probably a wooden knife your father whittled for you on a winter evening, both to practice your dexterity and to remind you that sooner or later you would have to know how to hold a knife with a steady hand. In the afternoons, when the church bells rang, the village children would gather in the clearing near the well to play chase. You would sit on your porch, watching from a distance. It wasn't that you didn't want to play, but because everything would stop if you approached. The laughter would die, the voices would falter, and a space would open up around you as if you had just stepped into a circle drawn on the ground. While other children heard stories of knights, princesses, or adventures on the high seas, you grew up with the stories your father told about the law. Not the laws written on paper, but stories of justice, punishment, and why every sentence needed to be carried out according to the law to maintain order. Your father didn't tell these stories in a threatening or boastful tone. He told them calmly, as if reading from an old history page. But for a child, those stories planted a simple idea in the mind. In this world, there are things that must be done, even if no one wants to do them. Your mother was different. She avoided mentioning her husband's work, and when she told you stories, she chose gentler ones. About the harvest, about merchants returning from distant ports, or about a lost sparrow that took shelter in the roof during winter. She never said it outright, but you understood that in the family, she was the one trying to hold on to a bit of normalcy so that your childhood wouldn't be completely consumed by the shadow of the family profession. You soon realized there were many types of gazes. There was the curious gaze, the pitying gaze, the suspicious gaze, and the gaze that wanted to stay away. You once tried to count which type you encountered most, and the result was always the same: the averted gaze. On the way to the market, when you and your mother passed by, the merchants, who were usually chatting animatedly, would suddenly find an excuse to turn away. Some would pretend to be busy rearranging their goods. Others would stare at you, just to remind themselves that they should keep their distance. No one said anything directly, but the air was thick enough for you to understand. No matter how politely you behaved, that distance would always exist. In this village, a child born into a blacksmith's family could dream of becoming a city guard. The son of a shipwright could dream of becoming a captain. But the executioner's child was not allowed to dream. Even if you were good at something else, baking, drawing, or storytelling, no one would give you the chance. This wasn't written into law, but it was stronger than law. It was custom, the silent consensus of the entire community. Your future was laid out, like a stone path leading straight to a gate that never opened in any other direction. When you were little, your father never said you had to follow his trade. But he also never said you could do anything else. Every lesson, every task you were given, guided you towards one endpoint: to stand in his place when the time came. The village you lived in was not large. In spring, the green meadows stretched to the horizon, and you could hear the distant lowing of cattle. In summer, the air was thick with the smell of barley and sweat. In autumn, the wind carried the scent of dry leaves and cooking smoke. In winter, snow covered the rooftops, turning the whole village into a quiet painting, broken only by the crunch of footsteps on the ice. But no matter the season, the rhythm of your life was different. You never fully partook in the spring festival, nor were you allowed to go to the fields to harvest grain with the other families in the fall. When the village held its winter fair, you only stood at the edge, feeling the music and smelling the food without touching them. Sometimes you thought you were like a tree at the edge of the forest, still alive, still green, but never truly a part of the real forest. In the village, children usually learn to read and write at the church, taught by the priest. But not you. It wasn't because your father thought literacy was useless. He still wanted you to know how to count, read legal documents, and write a few basic sentences, but because the priest didn't want you sitting with the other children. "It's not convenient," he said, in a polite tone, but his eyes said something else. "It's not proper. So you learn to read and write at home, with your father as your teacher and old parchments as your notebooks. Your handwriting was crooked at first, like a wooden fence in a storm, but gradually it straightened. Your father taught you how to read the names of crimes, how to tell time with an hourglass, and even how to measure the length of a rope to tie it correctly. These lessons were never spoken of outside. If anyone asked, you just said you could read the holy book and a few numbers. But the truth was, you knew much more. Knowledge that no one wanted to acknowledge, but that someone needed to keep. Despite being shunned by the whole village, you still had a few people to talk to. Not close friends, but people who, for whatever reason, didn't care about the curse on your family. There was the son of the night soil collector, a trade also considered lowly, so he understood your feelings somewhat. The two of you would meet occasionally, not talking much, just sitting together on the ditch bank, watching the water flow. There was also an old woman who lived near the forest, who would give you some dry bread when you passed by, and sometimes tell ancient stories that sounded like they came from another time. But most of the time, you were alone, inventing your own games, talking to yourself, and getting used to silence as a faithful companion. You never directly attended a trial when you were young, but you could feel the change in the atmosphere from early morning. The whole village suddenly seemed more tense. Voices were quieter, and footsteps were quicker. From a distance, you saw the crowd gathering in the square, like a tight circle, leaving an empty space in the middle. Your father left home on those days without a word. He didn't give you any special instructions, nor did he look back. It was part of the job. No one to see him off, no one to wish him luck, no one to ask questions. When he returned, his cloak heavy with the smell of the outdoors and sometimes smoke, he would hang it up as a habit. You and your mother would eat dinner as usual, talking about trivial things, as if that day was just an ordinary day. But in your mother's eyes, you saw something different, like a tightly closed door, meant to keep the past and present from mixing. Once, when you were about 8 years old, you told your mother you wanted to learn baking, because the smell of bread in the market always made you feel warm. Your mother didn't answer right away. She was just silent, placed a hand on your shoulder, and then smiled a small, sad smile. That smile wasn't to encourage, but to apologize. That evening, you heard your father talking to your mother in the kitchen. His voice was low and even. He should know sooner. Don't let him think he can be anything else. And so, you understood. Dreams could be beautiful, but here, they were not meant to be realized. Fate is strange. Society needed people like your family to uphold the law, but at the same time, it saw your family as a stain to be hidden away. You were like a post in a fence, necessary to maintain the boundary, but no one wanted to touch it. In the village, when someone was condemned, everyone wanted justice to be served. But once justice was served, they turned their backs on the one who served it. They didn't want to know how you felt, And they certainly didn't want to think that you also had feelings, hopes, or fears just like them. In winter, when the wind howled outside the door and snow covered the roof, the whole family would sit around the fire. The firelight flickered on the walls, casting the shadows of you and your parents to twice their size. The smell of burning wood mixed with the aroma of simmering stew, creating a warmth you rarely found elsewhere. In those moments, you forgot who you were. You were just a child, listening to your mother's stories, or quietly watching your father use a small knife to carve wood into strange shapes. Sometimes a bird, sometimes a miniature sword. But even in the most peaceful moments, somewhere deep in your mind, you still knew. The world outside did not see you the way you saw yourself. One spring morning, when dew still clung to the grass and the church bell had just rung its first toll, you heard strange footsteps on the dirt path leading to your house. Not the postman's steps, nor the priest's. These steps were heavy and even, like someone bearing unpleasant news. You didn't know that on that day, you would hear the first rumors of something that would change the entire village and your entire life, forever. In the village, every person had a specific place, like chess pieces set on a board from the start. Some were born to plow the fields, some to forge iron, some to trade, and some, like your family, were born to do the work that everyone needed, but no one wanted to speak of. That position did not change. It was not shaken, but it was circled by an invisible line. People could look at you from a distance, nod perfunctorily, but they rarely crossed that boundary. The villagers didn't fear you because of your father's axe, but because of the meaning attached to it. In their eyes, a blacksmith's blade was a tool, a butcher's knife was a trade, but your family's blade was the line between life and death. That fear was followed by contempt, a safe kind of contempt, because they knew you wouldn't react like other hot-tempered people. They could look at you with cold eyes, whisper something as you passed, and be assured that you would just keep walking in silence. The church, for instance. It was the center of all communal activities, where people prayed, held weddings, and listened to the priest's sermons. But your family's pew was always empty. Not because you were lazy about attending Mass, but because when the priest read the prayer for God to forgive all sins, the eyes of the entire church would, intentionally or unintentionally, turn towards you. The market was the same. You could still buy and sell there, but it felt like standing in a private market with a small empty space around you that no one would enter. The vendor would place the item on the counter, step back a little, and then gesture for you to take it. Not because they were afraid you would steal, but because they were afraid to touch hands. The village festival, that rare day when the entire village put aside their work to eat, drink, dance, and laugh all day, was not for you either. You could stand at the edge, watch the bright torches, hear the drums and strings mix with the cheers, but no one would ever invite you into the circle to dance. And yet, being an executioner's child had a strange advantage. No one dared to bully you. No pushing you down in the street. No pebbles thrown from a distance. No malicious teasing. Not because they cared for you, but because they were afraid of offending your family. In their minds, who knew what might happen one day? But that advantage brought no real sense of security. It was like people avoiding a chained dog, not out of affection, but out of fear of being bitten. That invisible boundary wasn't just in their eyes, it was in their sounds and gestures. The hurried whispers when you entered a shop, the slight step back when you approached the well, the slow creak of a wooden gate closing as you passed through an alley. At first, you noticed, but gradually, they became the background rhythm of your life, like the wind through the roof or the birds in the morning, something that always existed, whether you paid attention or not. In a village like that, you learned not to ask too many questions, not to look for too long, and not to smile too brightly. Every expression had to be just enough, so no one would think you were trying to push your way into their world. You got used to hearing stories from a distance, never interjecting, used to going to the market quickly, buying what you needed, and leaving before the eyes gathered on you. Used to standing outside the circle at the festival, where the torchlight didn't quite illuminate your face. That afternoon, the wind carried the smell of dry grass and cooking smoke. You were walking past the square when you heard loud laughter from the tavern. The door swung open, and a group of men stepped out, talking and laughing. But when they saw you, the laughter suddenly stopped. No one said a word. There was only the sound of the door closing behind you, low and slow. You continued on, hearing the wind and the echo of your own footsteps on the cobblestones, as if the whole village had just shrunk back a little. You didn't know that this distance, the distance you had been accustomed to your whole life, would soon be challenged when something even more fearsome than the executioner's family appeared. You were used to taking the long way home, avoiding the square when it was too crowded. Your family's house was on the edge of the village, next to a small forest, far from the tightly packed houses in the center. Outsiders would look and say, "It must be quiet there." But you knew well that quiet was not a gift, but a tactful push to the outside. The house was built more sturdily than most others, not because of wealth, but because your father needed a place strong enough that no one would dare break in at night. The heavy wooden gate, when closed, made a low, dull thud that silenced the village children. Adults never crossed that threshold unless absolutely necessary. The uninvited visits. Occasionally, people still came, not for tea or conversation, but to discuss business with your father. They stood in the yard, hands clutching the hems of their coats, speaking quickly, as if wanting to leave this place as soon as possible. They avoided looking you in the eye, as if your gaze could pull them into some dark place. You would stand quietly on the porch, hearing broken fragments of sentences, someone's name, a date, and some numbers. Every conversation ended with a heavy nod, then the sound of the gate closing. Then, the space would return to its heavy silence. Every morning, when you went to the well for water, you would encounter a few villagers there. No one chased you away, but the space between you and them was like an invisible wall. If they were talking to each other, they would stop when you approached, and only continue after you had turned to leave. The sound of water pouring from the wooden bucket into the pail echoed louder in that silence. Sometimes, you wanted to break the space with an idle question, but then you'd stop yourself, because you knew the answer you'd receive would be curt, and the silence that followed would only thicken. The village festival day, brilliant and warm with dance circles and the smell of roasted meat, only emphasized the distance. You stood outside, feeling like a spectator, forbidden from stepping onto the stage. The sound of the drums and fiddles vibrated in your chest, but your feet remained still on the cold ground. For a moment, your eyes met those of a child laughing brightly in the dance circle. The child stopped laughing for a second, looking at you as if seeing something both strange and distant. Then they turned away, swept up by the music. You stood there, like a misplaced punctuation mark on a page full of words. Living long enough in the shadow of the executioner's trade, you learned to build walls within yourself. Not walls of brick and stone, but walls of habit. The habit of not touching, the habit of not asking, the habit of not hoping for an invitation. And yet, somewhere deeper, there was still a part of you that wished to cross that boundary just once. A part that wanted to know what it felt like to be welcomed, for the laughter not to die when you drew near. But instead of trying to break down the wall, you learned to live in harmony with it. Because in this village, not all walls should be broken. Then one morning, when the dew was still on the grass, you heard hurried footsteps on the road leading into the village. Not the sound of familiar people, but the rushed sound of those bearing news or trouble. Your father was standing on the porch, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his knife. His eyes followed the road. Then he tilted his head slightly, signaling for you to go inside. You went in, but didn't close the door, so you could hear every word approaching. Someone's voice rang out, low and urgent. You need to know this, and you need to know it now. The distance between you and the outside world suddenly shrank, not because people wanted to pull you in, but because what was coming would not distinguish between who was inside or outside the wall. The day the strange news arrived, the village wasn't fully abuzz yet, but in your house, the atmosphere had changed. Your father spoke less, often standing by the window, his eyes fixed on the dirt road. Then one afternoon, as the last rays of sunlight crept slowly across the wall, he called you out to the yard. His voice was low and calm. It is time for you to learn what you must learn. You knew immediately he wasn't talking about plowing fields or trading goods. Your father was not a man for long explanations. He taught by making you observe, listen, and remember every detail. The family trade had no books or classes. The knowledge was in his calloused hands, in every slow movement that you had to watch long enough to engrave into your memory. In the early sessions, he didn't give you any tools. He only led you around the village and the surrounding areas, showing you the important places that others paid little attention to. The empty yard where villagers gathered, the cobblestone path leading to the town gate, the position of the old wooden post in the middle of the square. Understand the space, and you will understand the mood of the crowd, he said, his eyes still looking into the distance. The first training session took place in an empty yard. Your father made you stand still, eyes straight ahead, and do nothing. Just stand while he walked around you. The wind gently rustled your clothes, the sunlight touched your face, and time stretched out like a string with no end. Others will look at you. Some will scream. Some will throw venomous words. You must not let your face betray your emotions. Your eyes must be steady, your hands must be firm. It was not just advice, but a command. You realized this profession required more than strength of hand. It required the strength of silence. Another day, your father took you to the edge of the square when it was still early. He showed you how to move when all eyes were on you. Walk slowly, but without hesitation. Keep your back straight. Don't turn your head seeking approval. People will remember how you enter, even if they try to forget the rest, he said. And in this trade, the first impression is more important than you think. Beneath your feet, the cobblestones were still damp with dew. You heard your shoes echo, mixed with the sound of pigeons flapping their wings on a nearby roof. Those small sounds suddenly became distinct, as if you were learning to hear the whole world in a moment of stillness. Finally, your father let you touch the tools of the trade. They did not glint like a soldier's weapon, but were heavy and balanced in a strange way. He let you hold them, feel the weight pulling down on your wrist, and then guided you on how to hold them so your hand would not tremble. There were no words about using them. All exercises revolved around the feeling of the smooth wooden handle, of the cold metal blade in the early morning, and of the stillness while waiting. If your hand trembles, the whole village will see it, he reminded you, his voice not loud but firm. Your father took you out at different times of the day, sometimes at dawn, when dew still covered the branches, sometimes at high noon, when the harsh sun made everything glare, or at twilight, when the brilliant golden light turned everything into long, stretching shadows. You must learn to look to guess people's moods before they even say a word, he told you. You learn to observe the shoulders of an approaching person. If slightly tensed, it was stress. If relaxed, it could be acceptance. You watched how their hands clenched or opened, how they placed their feet on the ground. These small details, which outsiders might miss, were an entire book to your father. Another part of the training was learning to hear sounds. In the village, you realized footsteps were never the same. Someone with good news would step lightly and quickly. A hesitant person would walk slowly, pausing mid-step, as if afraid the sound would betray them. Your father showed you how to distinguish the sound of wind through a wall crack from the sound of a soft human whisper. How to recognize the sound of a bucket heavy with water from an empty one. To understand if someone was preparing for the market or preparing to leave the village. Listen even to what is not said, he emphasized. One autumn afternoon, as yellow leaves filled the yard, your father stood facing you and said, "To do this job, you must know when to breathe and when to hold it back." He made you inhale deeply, hold your breath, and then walk a circle around the yard without your chest heaving too obviously. At first, you felt uncomfortable and a little dizzy, but gradually, you understood his point. Sometimes, outer composure begins with controlling your own breath. There were days when he said nothing at all. He just gave you a wooden stool and told you to sit in the corner of the yard, staring at the old door. Time passed slowly, so slowly that you could clearly hear insects moving in the grass. You thought it was a punishment, but it was actually a lesson, getting used to waiting. In this profession, sometimes you have to stand for hours just waiting for a single moment to happen. If your mind is not steady, time will crush you before the work even begins. One morning, your father took you to the field near the village, where a wooden post stood straight, its shadow long on the damp earth. He told you to stand in different positions around that shadow, to feel when you were in the light and when you were in the dark. Know when to let people see your face clearly and when to let yourself sink into the shadows. He said, you realized this was not just a game with light, but part of the art of this profession, controlling the crowd's attention. Once you were used to holding the tools, your father made you hold them in your hands for hours without changing your posture. Your arms grew weary, your hands went numb, but he showed no sympathy. This is how you train your body not to betray you, he explained. After many weeks, you realized the weariness was not as daunting as before. Your arms learned how to distribute the force. Your hands learned to hold without tensing up. Occasionally, in the evening, your father would sit by the fire and tell you stories of those who came before, not to scare you, but to pass on experience. He told of one who lost his composure before the crowd and had to leave the village, of another who was too cold, causing the villagers to see him as heartless. From this, you understood that the balance between composure and humanity was the hardest thing to learn. On a cold winter night, your father stopped the training and looked you straight in the eye. This profession is not just what you do. You will live with it, sleep with it, carry it with you to the end of your days. You cannot cast it off, nor can you pretend to forget. His words echoed in your mind, like a soundtrack that never stopped. Then, like the natural end of any training period, one misty morning, you saw figures approaching the village. Your father watched them for a long time, then turned to you, his eyes heavy. Perhaps the waiting is over. And you knew that what you had learned for so long would soon be put to the test. That house stood on a piece of land that the villagers usually avoided. Outsiders looking in would only see a solitary house standing outside the city walls. But to you, it was a whole world, small, cold, and separated from all normal rhythms of life. The path leading to it was just a muddy strip of land, which turned into ankle-deep mud in the rainy season and hardened into cracked stone in the winter. Each step seemed to pull you further away from the laughter and lights of the market, further from the long ringing of the church bells every Sunday morning. In front of the house was an empty yard, where the wind always blew, unhindered by any obstacle, and a little further, where a normal person's gaze would avert, was the village's execution ground. Although you had never witnessed the scene in your early days, its mere presence gave the space around your home a different weight, as if every speck of dust, every gust of wind, also carried memories of what had happened there. Whenever the wind was strong, the wooden post standing on the execution ground would emit a soft whistle, like a swallowed sigh. The ropes, though put away after each use, still left deep marks in the wood, and when the wind swept through, that sound mingled with the distant cawing of crows. You used to wonder if those birds returned here because of the memory of food, or simply because in this place, humans always left their mark longer than anywhere else. In the morning, a thick fog often covered this land, turning your entire house into a blurry shadow in the opaque white. You could stand at the door and look out, seeing the silhouettes of the wooden posts rising silently from the mist, like gray fingers pointing to the sky. That feeling both made you feel a part of this place and made you want to turn away. Your father once said, "This distance is a shield, but it is also a shackle." A shield, because no one wanted to come near your house without a compelling reason. And a shackle, because you could not step out of here without carrying the scrutinizing gaze of the entire village. When you were young, you thought you would get used to walking that long dirt path into the village. But then you realized the unpleasant part was not the length or the mud, but the moment you passed through the city gate. There, all conversations would quiet for a moment, as if the wind had been blocked. A few people would continue their work, but their eyes would follow you until you were out of sight. Inside the house, everything was arranged neatly and simply. Your father always kept the house clean, not to impress, but because he believed that inner order could combat outer chaos. The windows of your house were narrow and high, so the winter wind wouldn't blow straight in. But that also meant the light was always faint, especially on overcast days. You grew up in that dim light, learning to see everything clearly, even when darkness had swallowed most of the details. In winter, frost coated every stone of the house, making the walls so cold that if you placed your hand on them, it felt like touching a block of ice. In summer, despite the scorching sun, the house retained the coolness of earth and stone, a coolness that wasn't exactly pleasant, but more like the breath of a place that had never truly warmed up. Your father explained that living near the execution ground was not a punishment, but a social convention. They need us, but they do not want us among them. It took you many years to fully understand that sentence. At festivals, your family was never invited. In the church, if you went, the looks from everyone would make you want to turn right back. But when the village had a need, when the law required someone to do the job no one else wanted to do, they would come to your house, walk the entire muddy path, knock on the door, and speak in a voice they tried to make sound calm. There were days when the entire land was submerged in absolute silence. Only the sound of the wind blowing through the meadows, the rustling of crows' wings, and occasionally the creak of wooden wheels on stone when someone brought supplies to your family. They never stayed long. After delivering the goods, they left as quickly as they came, as if afraid that their presence here for too long would leave an unwanted mark. You grew up amidst such days. Days when distance was measured not just by footsteps, but by silence, gazes, and invisible boundaries. In winter, the wind from the open fields whipped against the house walls, howling through the cracks of the wooden door like a distant call. You would often lie under the blankets, listening to that wind for hours, thinking about what your father had taught you. You must learn to live with all sounds, whether it's the wind, the crows, or the heavy footsteps of someone coming to knock on your door. In summer, the wind brought the smell of dry grass and dust, sometimes mixed with a faint metallic scent from the execution ground. The smell was very light, but it was deeply ingrained in your memory, so much so that whenever you smelled it elsewhere, you would immediately remember this house. No matter what you did, the feeling of not belonging always clung to you. You knew that if you left this house and went deep into the village, You would just be a lost shadow in the crowd. But when you returned, setting foot on the dirt path leading to your home, you felt something else. A feeling like entering a territory that everyone had tacitly given your family the right to guard. Your father called it the in-between land. Not entirely part of the village, but not entirely your own either. It existed because people wanted it to, and because you couldn't change that. At night, from your window, you could see the lights from the houses inside the city walls. Small, flickering, like stars fallen to earth. Sometimes, the sound of singing or festival music would reach your ears on the wind, faint as if echoing from another world. You didn't feel sad, but you couldn't call it joy either. It was like looking at a beautiful book you were not allowed to open. There were winter mornings when you stepped outside and felt the cold seep into your very bones. Your breath turned into white smoke, your hands numb, even when hidden in your sleeves. The sound of the wind whistling through the gallows post mixed with the cries of birds, creating a strange kind of music. Not gentle, but not exactly unpleasant either. It was the sound of this place, the sound you had heard since you were born, and would probably hear until your last day. Then one day, that silence was broken. From a distance, you heard the sound of hooves, the heavy roll of wheels on stone, and the church bell ringing at noon, an unusual time. Your father stepped out the door, stood silently for a long time, his eyes on the road leading into the village. "They will come here," he said, his voice lowering. "And from now on, you will see that this isolation is only the prelude." You didn't know exactly what he meant, but in your heart, a vague feeling crept in, like when the wind changes direction, signaling an approaching storm. The church, for most villagers, was the heart of the community. It was where people were born, grew up, married, and finally departed from this world. Every joy, sorrow, ceremony, or important event was tied to those gray stone walls, with its tall bell tower and heavy wooden doors. But for your family, the church was like a sealed fortress. You could still see it, still hear the bells ring, still know that sacred rites were happening inside. But that door never truly opened for you. Since you were a child, you had heard people call you by an unofficial title, the necessary sinner. It sounds contradictory, but that was precisely how the church and the villagers saw your family. You did the work no one wanted to do, but no one wanted to publicly admit they needed you. The priest never said it outright, "You are not welcome." But the way he glanced away when he passed you was enough for you to understand. Even when he nodded in greeting, his eyes still held something both pitying and distant, as if an invisible wall always stood between you and him. On major occasions, Christmas, Easter, or the feast day of the village's patron saint, the entire community would gather in the church. From your doorstep, you could still hear the urgent ringing of the bells, the resounding hymns, and the giggling of children running around the yard. But stepping through that door was another matter. You tried once when you were small. In an old but clean-washed shirt from your mother, you timidly stepped inside. People said nothing, but unusual gaps appeared in the pews around you. Someone coughed softly, then again, as if to make a point. Another child turned to look, was immediately pulled back by their mother, and you clearly heard the whisper, "Sit a little further away." That day, You left before the service was over, feeling as if you had accidentally trespassed into a place you shouldn't have been. There were rites that your family rarely, if ever, got to participate in fully. Confession. The priest would still listen, but the words of absolution seemed heavier, less warm than what you saw him offer others. Communion. Sometimes, when it was your turn, he would move on to the next person before coming back, as if intentionally or unintentionally reminding you that you were not like the rest of the community. Burial. This was the most painful. Some executioners who passed away were not buried in the main cemetery, but in a separate plot, far off at the edge. No large cross, no one to read prayers for the departed, just a few wooden planks and the cold sound of falling earth. Your father once said, "While we live, they need us to enforce the law. But when we die, they want to forget us as quickly as possible." You often wondered, if my job is to maintain order, to protect justice, why does the church consider me unclean? In the naive thoughts of your childhood, you used to believe that God would understand, that he would see the reason behind your actions. But then, as you grew older, you realized the church did not see it that way. To them, the act of taking a life, even if permitted by law, was an indelible stain. Your reasoning could not change that. Once, you asked the priest directly, "If God wants justice, why is the one who carries it out excluded?" He was silent for a long time, then said, "There are things beyond human understanding." You heard and understood that there would never be a real answer. When it became abundantly clear that you would never be fully integrated into the religious community, you began to build a faith of your own. No church needed, no rituals, just quiet moments when you sat alone by the fire, listening to the wind through the door cracks. You prayed silently, not in words, not with memorized prayers. You taught your children that goodness does not come from a seat in a church, but from what you do when no one is watching. You believed that somewhere there was a greater justice, one that no judge or priest could change. From then on, your relationship with the church was like two parallel roads, never crossing, but still running in the same direction. You still heard the bells, still knew the service times, still smiled when you saw the procession pass your house. But you no longer tried to step inside. There were winter mornings when you stood in the yard, holding a warm cup of water, watching the smoke rise from the distant church roof. In that moment, you felt both near and far. Near, because it was part of the village. Far, because it would never be a part of you. And then, when night fell, when the wind whistled through the open space outside the city walls, and the cawing of crows echoed somewhere, you would wonder again, on the last day of my life, will the church bells ring for me? Or will they remain silent, letting me depart as if I never existed? You didn't know the answer, and perhaps you no longer needed to know, because deep down, you had accepted that some doors are not meant for you. That day, when you stepped out of the house, you knew the whole village would be waiting for you. Not because they were fond of you, nor because they wanted to hear you say anything. They waited to witness. In your line of work, each execution was no different from an open-air performance. The audience crowded together, finding the best spot as if at a fair. And their mood was a strange mixture of curiosity, judgment, and a bit of excitement they would never admit. Your stage was nothing grand. An empty plot of land, sometimes right in the square, sometimes outside the city walls. No soft seats, no roof, just the ground, a wooden post, and an empty space in the middle where all eyes were fixed. You had no right to choose your audience. They came from everywhere. Men, women, children. Some came out of curiosity, some because they saw it as a cautionary tale. Some just wanted to be sure the sentence was carried out. Each had a reason, but they all made you the center of attention. Your task was not just to complete the job, it had to be completed properly. For an executioner, properly meant quick, clean, and, one might even say, elegant, though that word sounds truly ironic in this context. The people did not want to witness clumsiness. A mistake, however small, could turn the tense silence into a wave of whispers, then into hisses, even jeers. And in this line of work, your honor was tied to how you silenced the crowd. Your father once warned, "You only get one chance. Do it well, and everyone will leave without a word. Do it poorly, and they will remember it for the rest of their lives." The minutes before the event always had an indescribable atmosphere. The crowd gathered, the murmur of conversation like wind through a rice field. Children were lifted onto shoulders for a better view. Street vendors hawked their wares softly so as not to spoil the upcoming solemn moment. You stood there, feeling all those eyes scrutinizing you. No matter how many times you had done this, your heart still beat faster than usual. Not out of fear, but because you understood that with just one slip, everything would turn. In a strange moment, you and the crowd almost had a silent bond. They didn't like you, and you didn't expect them to. But when everyone was watching a single act, all boundaries temporarily blurred. Your success made them nod, then quietly disperse. Your failure gave them something to talk about for months, even years. You became a story told over and over in taverns, by firesides, in the morning markets. Memory of a failure. No matter how skilled you were, there would be a day when things didn't go as planned. You remember one winter morning, the wind so cold it cut the skin. Your hands were stiff, your breath turned to fog. The crowd that day was unusually large, and you felt their anticipation like an invisible pressure weighing on your shoulders. When the moment came, a small detail went awry. Not something irreversible, but enough to create a whisper that spread like wildfire. You still completed the task, but as you turned to leave, you knew you had just left a stain in their eyes. The next day, when you went to the market for salt, you heard someone say, "Yesterday wasn't very smooth, was it?" That was all it took. You understood that honor in this profession was more fragile than any rope you had ever touched. Outsiders might think you were used to it, but the truth is, every time you stood before the crowd, you had to hold yourself together tightly. You couldn't let your hands shake, couldn't let your eyes waver. Every movement had to be certain, as if you had practiced your whole life for it. And in fact, you had. You learned to control your breath, your expression, and even the distance between you and the crowd, so you wouldn't feel their breath and gazes too closely. It was a survival skill, no less than a professional one. When the job was done, the crowd dispersed. They would go home, continue their lives, eat dinner, tell each other stories. As for you, you remained there, or walked home to the edge of the city walls, carrying the whispers that still lingered in the wind. You understood one thing. Here, success was never celebrated. Only failure was long remembered. And so, you had to live with the pressure that every time you went before the crowd could be the time they carved your name into their memory, but not for the reason you would want. As the crowd began to disperse, the square gradually returned to the state it was in before you arrived. The whispers faded away. The footsteps mingled and then disappeared into the narrow alleys. The thick atmosphere of anticipation and judgment from moments ago slowly dissipated, leaving behind a thin silence, as if nothing had ever happened. But for you, that morning was not over. Your work did not stop when everyone turned their backs. If the execution was the main event, then what followed was the backstage. The part no one wanted to see, but everyone knew existed. No one in the village wanted to take on this task, and no one volunteered to help. They had seen enough, and that was sufficient. The rest was all your part. You began to clean up what had been set up at the crack of dawn. Ropes, wooden posts, or any tool used that morning had to be checked, stored away, or if broken, replaced. Everything had to be tidy, ready for the next time. There were times when it started to rain just as the crowd left. The cold drops made your hands numb, but you still had to wipe everything clean, put it away neatly, not letting them rot. No one cared how harsh the weather was, as long as on the day of need, everything was ready. Your profession was not confined to those public mornings. Behind the scenes, there were quieter, more regular, and sometimes heavier tasks. There were days when your task was to brand, a red-hot iron pressed onto wood, cloth, or even evidence, marking the authority of the law. A soft sizzle, the smell of smoke, all taking place in a small room where dim light streamed through a narrow window. Sometimes, you were assigned to erect the pillory at a crossroads. It wasn't a job that required strength, but meticulous care. Everything had to be in the right place, at the right height, in the right position, for everyone passing by to see. They called it a visual lesson, but you knew it was part of a system of control. And sometimes, there were more discreet tasks, never mentioned publicly, like guarding those awaiting trial, or assisting with procedures no one wanted to get their hands on. The backstage of this work had no bright lights, no cheers. Instead, there was the creaking of wood, the clinking of metal, and the sound of your own breath echoing in the empty space. The place you worked was often just big enough to turn around in, with a few old tables, some racks, and a mixed smell of rotten wood, coarse cloth, and the cold of stone. You became so accustomed to that silence that sometimes it felt like a thick blanket wrapped around you. Not exactly comfortable, but you didn't want to cast it off either. After everything was done, when you had removed the traces of the morning, you would often sit for a while, not to rest, but to listen to the silence spread around you. There were days you felt like you were the only one left on stage after the audience had gone home. That feeling was strange, lonely, and familiar. In the silence, you had time to think about the work you did, about the faces that had passed through, and about why. Even though people needed you, they never wanted to stand beside you. You understood that this backstage part was the time for all emotions to settle. If out there was the climax, then here was the after echo. And sometimes, the echo was more haunting than the main event itself. People thought an executioner only worked on certain mornings, but the truth is, this job clung to you all day. Everything you saw, touched, or heard was more or less connected to the profession. Even when you walked home, you still carried a part of the backstage in your memory. Images no one wanted to keep, but you couldn't discard. As the sun began to set, the last golden light streaming through the doorway, you knew you had finished everything. The small room was locked, the tools in their proper place, and the road home opened before you. You walked on the familiar path, hearing the wind blow through the trees, seeing the lights in the village begin to be lit from afar. In that moment, you almost forgot you had just gone through a day's work that the whole village knew about, but no one wanted to mention. And you knew, tomorrow, when a new order came, everything would start all over again. They often say, money can buy anything. But as an executioner, you soon learned that saying was only true for everyone else. In the silent days after each execution, you would sit and count the coins you earned. They were far more than what most villagers had, even several times more than a diligent farmer's yearly income. But the coins in your hand felt like they had a different color, a different smell, and a different weight. People called it blood money, and that very name decided its fate. You earned enough to buy fresh meat every week, instead of only on holidays. You could buy better cloth to make clothes, or save a portion in case of illness. But none of that meant you were truly rich in the way people understood it, because you couldn't spend money like a normal person. You walk into the tavern, and silence immediately falls. The owner takes your money, but his eyes look as if he wants to put it in a separate corner, avoiding contact with the other coins. The tailor takes your fabric, but works in silence, quickly handing the product out the door so no one has to witness the scene. Your money was still money, but in everyone's eyes, it carried an invisible mark, a stain that could not be washed away. There were places you had never set foot in, not because you couldn't afford it, but because the doors would not open for you. Some of the large fairs in the city, the festivals the villagers looked forward to all year, or the inns where foreign merchants stayed, all seemed to have an invisible wall blocking you. You knew very well that if you tried to enter, the stares would turn into whispers, and the whispers would turn into reasons to kick you out. And at that point, the money in your pouch would have no value at all. Once, you tried to buy a better horse to replace the old, weak one that had served for many years. The horse owner, an old man who had lived his whole life in the village, looked you up and down and said, "Your money is heavy, but I'm afraid this horse doesn't suit your profession." That sentence echoed in your head for weeks. Doesn't suit your profession. As if even the animal would be tainted by your work just by changing owners. The paradox was, the longer you were in the trade, the more wealth you accumulated, and at the same time, the fewer people you could share it with. You couldn't invite anyone to your home for a fancy meal because they would never accept. You couldn't show off a new purchase because their eyes would only reflect a silent question. Where did you get this? Money made your life less harsh materially, but it deepened the distance with the rest of the world. It was like a wall built from gleaming coins, both protecting you and trapping you inside. Sometimes, You wondered, what is the real price of this profession? Is it the contempt of the villagers, the closed doors, or is it the fact that you traded the ability to live like a normal person for a few more coins? On nights spent sitting by the fire, you would flip a coin over and over in your hand, hearing the soft clink of metal. The sound was both sweet and bitter. It reminded you that everything you had was paid for by standing before a crowd, coldly completing the work no one else wanted to do. You knew that one day, these coins would no longer mean much. When age came, when your hands were no longer steady and your eyes no longer sharp, someone younger would step up to take your place. And then, a lifetime of savings couldn't buy back your presence in people's eyes. All that would be left would be memories. Memories of a profession that society needed but never wanted to touch. And you understood the next chapter of the story would no longer be about money, but about how an executioner disappears from the stage of his own life. There is one thing that anyone bearing the executioner's family name soon realizes. This profession does not die with you. It's like a shadow that never leaves, and as you grow old, it simply transfers to a smaller form, the tiny hands of the child you hold. You remember that moment clearly, the day your first child was born. For the first few seconds, you didn't think about the trade, about sentences, or about blood. You only thought of a new life, of a cry that rang out like the signal of a beginning. But then, like a rush of cold water, the thought flooded in. My child will grow up, bear my name, and with it, bear the sentence no one can see. Children don't know how to distinguish between normal people and outcasts until the world teaches them. Your child, in their first years, would smile at anyone, would run into the village with bright eyes upon seeing a procession or a fair. But then gradually, you saw their steps slow as they noticed the looks from others. One autumn morning, as yellow leaves tumbled down the dirt path, your son ran back, hugged your leg tightly, and whispered, "Father, why won't they play with me?" You were silent for a long time before answering. Not because you didn't know what to say, but because you knew any words would become part of the shield they would carry for the rest of their life. Your father had taught you this trade with short, cold, and direct sentences. No coddling, no softness. Only the work, and it had to be done right. But you, looking into your child's eyes, saw something different. A hesitation, not because they were weak, but because they didn't yet understand why they had to learn these things. You took their hand, guided them on how to sharpen a blade, not for them to do it immediately, but for them to know the family's tools. You taught them how to tie knots, not saying what the rope would be used for, only that it was a necessary skill. But every lesson carried a crack in your heart. You knew you were replanting the seed of the shadow that had covered your entire life. Every night you asked yourself, what if one day they refuse? What would you do if your child stood before you, eyes determined, and said they didn't want to continue? Could you let go? Let the family line break? Or would you tighten your grip, forcing them onto the path as you had been forced? That question never had a clear answer. Because here, between duty and love, there was no bright line. You wanted to protect your child from rejection, and you wanted them to be free. But in this world, freedom was sometimes so expensive that no one could afford it. The first day you took your child to the training yard was a gray day. No bird song, only the sound of wind sweeping across the empty ground behind the house. You placed a wooden staff in their hand, a stand-in for the real tool, and said, "Hold it tight." They did, their eyes never leaving yours. And you realized, in that moment, they weren't afraid, just waiting for you to tell them what to do next. The lesson wasn't about technique, but about how to stand, how to breathe, how to remain calm when all eyes were on you. You taught them that, before a crowd, trembling is the enemy. You remembered the days when your father stood where you were now. His gaze, both strict and distant, as if he was trying to keep a wall between father and child in case that wall ever collapsed. But you couldn't do that. You saw every drop of sweat on your child's forehead, every frown as they tried to do it right. And you wondered, were you breaking an invisible rule of this trade? The rule that emotions only make things harder. Though you knew this profession spared no one, you still silently hoped for one thing. If they had to continue, at least your child would enter with open eyes, not as someone being led, but as someone who knew what they were doing and why. You knew that out there, the world would still see them as part of the family shadow. But in your home, you wanted them to see themselves as a person before a profession. There were nights when the whole family was asleep. You sat at the table, your hands resting on a worn blade, and said to yourself, or perhaps to your father, somewhere far away, "I will not let him lose himself the way you let me lose myself." That sentence didn't change anything, but it helped you sleep, at least until the next morning, when another lesson would begin. You soon understood. Money was not the only thing binding you to this profession. There was another bond, stronger, colder, the red wax seal of the authorities. It appeared on every order, every sentence, every summons in the middle of the night. And for someone like you, that seal was the invisible hand that gripped your wrist, gently but absolutely. Your father once said, "The villagers scorn you because they fear you. The authorities do not scorn you. They use you." That sentence, so stark at first, gained the weight of cold iron over the years. You learned to recognize the knock of an official's man, not rushed, not slow, even as a metronome, devoid of emotion. They would leave a sealed leather tube at your door, inside which was the execution order, stamped with wax. The round impression, its edges flecked, the smell of beeswax mixed with lamp smoke, so recognizable you could guess the contents without even opening it. On paper, everything was by the book. Date, time, crime, in the name of the law. But paper has no face, and you do. You had to bring that face before the crowd, in place of all those who signed their names but never appeared. On such nights, the fire was still warm. Your child still slept soundly, but the night was marked by that knock on the door. You would blow out one more rushlight, letting the darkness thicken a bit, so thick that the lingering questions could find no purchase. You once thought you were just a machine of the law. Then you gradually realized the law wore many hats. One day, the order came from a judge, speaking of order. The next, from a lord, speaking of stability. Another day, from the court, speaking of the crown's authority. The words changed, but the result was always the same. You had to do it. When the village was in turmoil over land, a letter arrived quickly. The crime hastily written, inciting unrest. When a wealthy merchant's house suddenly burned down, a cart driver suddenly had a file as thick as a tax ledger. These duties were woven with solemn words, covering the smell of politics like a white linen cloth. You stood at the end of the chain of command, with no right to ask if that chain began with justice or with ambition. There were cases that made your nights as heavy as stone. A gentle miller, accused for daring to protest a rise in the flour tax. A messenger, branded a conveyor of treason, merely for keeping the contents of a nobleman's letter secret. The file was perfectly in order, the wax seal perfectly red, the witness testimony perfectly loud. The only thing missing was the truth. You would arrive with two hands that had memorized every calm motion. You did it because to refuse meant turning yourself into the accused. And afterward came the emptiness. Not the emptiness of the square. People still walked, still traded, but the emptiness in your heart, where questions could find no one to answer them. Sometimes, the darkness knew how to bargain. A family member of someone would approach you, whispering, "Make it quick, make it clean, so there's no fuss." In return was a heavy purse of silver, or a vague guarantee at court. You understood. They didn't want to save anyone. They only wanted to save themselves from the crowd's gaze, from the gossip. In that market of morality, you were both a seller of silent services and a mirror for them to soothe themselves. Whether you took the money or not, the night was just as heavy, because what needed saving wasn't the morning, but what came after. You learned to read a face and predict a storm. When an official wrote an order on thick paper, with careful script, it was a small matter. When the order was written hastily, the ink still smudged. It was a battle between men. At that point, the law was just a prop on the stage of conflict. On the ladder of power, you stood on the bottom rung. Above you were the actors, the playwrights, the ticket sellers. You were the one who turned off the lights after the show, and then cleaned the stage. One day, if the main actor wanted to change roles, you might even become the curtain that hid the costume change. You began to write things down. Not a ledger for money, nor a log of duties. You kept a gray book. Each page, a name you did not believe was guilty. Just a few lines. Age, profession, a small detail like a leaf-shaped scar on the left hand, or often soothed his child with a strange song. That book had no power. It couldn't overturn a sentence, couldn't open the church doors, but it kept you standing straight in the darkness, a way of whispering to yourself, "I see them." And strangely, writing gave the pain a shape. And once it had a shape, it was less likely to consume you. Did you ever think of disobeying an order? Of course. Everyone thinks about it. But someone like you doesn't have the luxury of thinking for long. One act of disobedience meant you and your family would be cast to the absolute fringe. Your house would no longer be just outside the city walls. It would be outside all boundaries. In your profession, a single misstep doesn't just set you back. A single misstep means you disappear. So you learn to resist within a narrow margin, demanding documents be in proper order, insisting on procedure, drawing things out just a little so a family member could have a final look, making it clean so it wouldn't become a spectacle for the tavern. Small acts of resistance, but for someone on the bottom rung, sometimes that was everything. You memorized their catchphrases. In the name of order. For the peace of the people. We cannot allow a bad precedent. The words were soft as silk, flowing into your ears like honey. But when they dried, they held fast as nails. You also gradually created your own language. Short, unemotional, just recording facts. Because you knew that in a world where words could become shackles, silence was often the last wall of defense. That night, it rained. The messenger was soaked as if he had just stepped out of the river. The paper was swollen with rainwater, the edges of the wax seal blurred. The crime, inciting rebellion. The name, a young scholar from the South Side, the boy who had once secretly left bread on your doorstep when your child was sick. You finished reading, placed the order near the hearth, but not so close the fire would catch it. It couldn't burn. You didn't have the authority to lose it. The next morning, everything proceeded as usual, which is to say, by the book. There was only one small difference that only you knew. You slowed the rhythm of everything down just a bit, enough for the father to arrive, to put a hand on his son's shoulder, to say something too quiet for the crowd to hear. You couldn't change the outcome, but sometimes a slower rhythm was the small piece of humanity you could snatch back from the machine. The villagers avoided you out of awkwardness, fear, superstition. The ones who signed the orders scorned you in a more expensive way. They smiled, poured wine, called you a good friend of order, then wrote your name in a corner of their ledger as an operating expense. During a rare drinking occasion, a young official raised his glass. With you, the machine runs smoothly. You nodded, smiled just enough, thinking to yourself, it's smooth because of the oil, and oil is something no one wants on their hands. You didn't want your child to learn only technique. You wanted them to know the margins of conscience. You taught them to read every order carefully, to memorize the face of the person who delivered it, to ask about the time, the witnesses, the procedure in a calm voice. Not to argue, but to force the system to look at itself for a few more seconds. And upon returning, if something made the night heavier, write it in the gray book. Give a name to the anguish, you told your child. When it has a name, it has less power over you. Eventually, you understood. You were the end of the order, but not where justice ended. Justice, if it existed, traveled on paths you no longer had the strength to follow. As for you, you would grow old, your steady hands becoming tremulous. Above, the seals were still red. Below, mud still clung to your shoes. And when you left the stage, the gray book would remain, lying in a wooden drawer, amidst the smell of damp wind and beeswax. You ended a day, blew out the lamp. Outside, the bell tower still stood. The city walls were still thick, and the ladders of power were still climbed up and down with regularity. Inside, you heard your child turn over, whispering a vague name in their sleep. You placed a hand on the book, knowing the end was near. An end not for the eloquent, but for the one who had learned to be silent while still acknowledging the truth. And yes, the next chapter of your life would be about aging, doubt, and being forgotten, where the machine finds new oil, and you find a way out of the gears without trampling on your own soul. If the authorities held you with a wax seal, the villagers held you with rumors. Not rumors from those who had actually seen your face, but mostly from places that had never seen you once. The farther away, the more bizarre the stories about you became, the more spices were added, as if they were recounting a dark fairy tale by the hearth. A village to the north, rumored that you drank the blood of criminals after each execution to maintain your strength. They even described in detail that you had a silver cup engraved with a skull, used only for this ritual. You heard this for the first time from a merchant who shivered as he told it, and you didn't know whether to laugh or sigh. In another region, children were told that the executioner was the adopted child of the devil. On a full moon, the devil would visit, place a black sword in your hand, and in return, you would swear an oath of eternal service. The elders told this in a hushed voice, leaving the children half believing, half fearing, not daring to go outside whenever they heard strange footsteps. One particularly persistent story, that you were once sentenced to death for treason, hung on the gallows, but the rope broke 3 times. So the law had to release you and give you the job of executioner as a heaven-sent destiny. The villagers recounted this with a mixture of awe and terror, and no one thought to ask you if it was true. You knew these legends were sometimes useful. They kept drunkards from blocking your path, made thieves skip your house at night, but they also built a wall, making handshakes and greetings as rare as a cloudless day. Inside that wall, you were still just a person who had to check the bread, mend a torn shirt, and listen to your child mispronounce words. But outside, you were forever a character in a story told on a cold night, with eyes turned towards your closed door. Not every day brought an order. Not every morning began with a knock on the door. There were strangely long periods when you would wake up without having to prepare for the crowd. On those days, you returned to the part of ordinary life that no one wanted to believe you had. Your cloak, the one everyone thought you only wore during executions, actually needed to be mended like any other piece of cloth. You knew which part of the house leaked, which door needed another hinge. Your chicken coop was just like any other. The smell of straw, the clucking, a few fussy old hens. Some days, you would take your basket to the market, choose vegetables, smell the onions, haggle with the fishmonger. The gazes around you were still a bit wary, but not as harsh as in the square. At the market, you were just a buyer and seller, as long as you paid the right price and didn't cut in line. Even so, stories about you still circulated. Some said, the executioner eats a lot of fish to keep his hands strong, while others swore you only bought bread from one specific bakery that had been blessed. You tried to enjoy the tranquility, but that tranquility was like the surface of a lake you knew someone would throw a stone into. Every sound of hooves on the road could be the signal of a very different day. Every time you saw a stranger heading towards your house, your heart sank a little. So, even on days without executions, the shadow of the profession was still there, stretching across the yard, mingling with the shadow of the porch. Nevertheless, these were also the days you remembered you were still human, not a legend, not a tool. You heard your child sing a folk song off-key, heard the water boil for dinner, and sometimes you even forgot what profession you were in, until the sound of hooves echoed again, or a stiff knock on the door shattered the afternoon. One day, you realized your hands were no longer as steady as before. It wasn't because of any major event, just that, while tying a bundle of firewood, you found it took you a few extra seconds, and the knot was still a bit loose. The next day, when lifting a bucket of water, you had to stop midway to switch hands. Time asks no one's permission, not even the executioner's. The signs came slowly, silently, like the night dew. Your steps slowed a little. Your eyes needed to squint to see details from afar. Your ears began to miss a few sounds. You could still do your job, but you yourself knew that the precision this profession demanded was becoming difficult to maintain. When you were young, you thought you would know in advance your last day in the trade. But in reality, it didn't come as an announcement, but as a gradually growing shadow, slowly obscuring your vision. One morning, the priest stopped by, not to give a blessing, but to say that the authorities had chosen a younger man to stand beside you to learn the trade. It sounded like an opportunity for you to pass on your skills, but you knew it was also their way of preparing to replace you without having to say it directly. The apprentice was young, with strong hands, bright eyes, and not yet burdened by years of memories. He asked you all sorts of things, looking at you with a mixture of respect and eagerness. You taught him as your father had taught you, but somewhere in your heart, you felt a cold emptiness. There were nights you lay still in the dark, listening to the wind, and asked yourself, how many sentences I carried out were on the right person? How many times was I just a tool for an order that could not be refused? And if one of them was wrong, how long will I carry it with me? You didn't speak these questions aloud, partly because they had no answers, and partly because saying them wouldn't change anything. But they were there, like small stones dropped into a well, the echoes repeating over and over. The official day came, with no fanfare, no announcement. It was just a morning you weren't called. Instead, the new apprentice set out with a few assistants. You stayed home, watching through the window, seeing their figures disappear down the dirt road. The next day, and the day after that, still no one came for you. You understood. It was over. Without a word, everyone knew you were no longer the man for the job. The final years of an executioner's life were not much different from the early years, except for the silence. No crowd, no cheers, or contemptuous gazes. Only the wind through the abandoned wooden post, and a few old stories trickling through the tavern about the man who used to stand there. When you died, no one rang the church bell. A few people might remember, but only like remembering a detail in an old story. Your grave was at the edge of the cemetery, far from the neat rows of graves. A small headstone with only your name and years. No trade, no title. Perhaps the greatest meaning of your life was not in the work, but in the fact that you kept your family alive in a position where no one wanted to be. You raised your child, maintained your home, and despite bearing the title, the gravedigger of justice, you never let your family starve. You understood that the justice you served was not always perfect, but it was the only thing you were given to uphold. And perhaps, as time gradually erases your name, the only thing that will remain will be silence. A silence no longer heavy, but simply like a door closing after a long story. Looking back, you realize that your life, and the lives of generations of executioners before and after, was like a worn path. Narrow, long, and one few wanted to walk. That path was not strewn with flowers, nor greeted with music. only old footprints piled on top of each other through the years. You were not a hero, nor a villain. You were just a person born to shoulder a part of the work that society didn't want. That work left a scar in the eyes of the world, but it also left moments of silent self-respect. When you knew you had maintained precision, had saved someone from more pain than was necessary. If there is anything to say to those who will hear this story, it is this. Sometimes, the people standing on the fringes of society are the very ones who keep the center from collapsing. They are not invited to the banquet, but they are the reason the table does not fall. And then, when night falls, when all the noise subsides, all of us, no matter who we are the same, seeking a quiet place to lay our heads, to breathe more slowly, to let our minds drift away from what the day has bound us to. There, no one is an executioner. No one is a farmer or a nobleman. There are only human beings with the same simple dreams of peace. And so, the story comes to a close. The torch of the execution ground has long been extinguished. The noise of the crowd has faded into the night. All that remains is the gentle wind, slipping through the rooftops, carrying the scent of earth, of wood, and a little warmth from a dying fire. Let your body relax, like a bowstring that is no longer taut. Let every image, every sound of the story drift away, fading, dissolving into the gentle darkness. Close your eyes. Feel your breath becoming slower, lighter, and deeper. Tonight, you are safe. Every burden, every noise, every gaze of the world is left behind the closed door. May you have a truly peaceful sleep, a sleep with no bad dreams, only vast fields, soft moonlight, and the wind whispering stories that will never frighten you. Sleep well.